But we are still in Isaiah 53. We're coming to this fourth servant song. And this is where the rubber hits the road in a lot of things. I mentioned last week that this fourth servant song, Isaiah 52:13 all the way to the end of 53, is quoted 7 times in the New Testament. In Romans, in John, Romans again, Matthew, 1 Peter, Acts chapter 8, and 1 Peter again, where they're quoting from 52:15, then verse 1, verse 4, all the way up to the verse 9. So this is a very prominently featured passage in the New Testament time period. Now, if you remember, with all of this, the role of Israel was to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation through all of this. And as priests, as the nation, the kingdom of priests, were to facilitate not only their own worship, but to facilitate the worship and approach of all the other nations, to approach the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not just as they saw fit, not just as they wanted to, not to approach and go behind the curtain anytime they felt like it, but in the way that he prescribed. And as priests, they were to be carriers of the good news of their inclusion, that invitation that comes through the Messiah, this faithful servant. And so when you look at that passage, when he quotes from Romans 15, when he's in Romans 15, and he's quoting from chapter 52, verse 15, he understood his role. He understood his times as fulfilling of this passage that we're going to be looking at. He understood the grace and the purpose that was given to him. And he describes it as to be a servant of Messiah Yeshua. Remember, this is all about the servant song, but he himself is a servant of that servant. To be a servant of Messiah Yeshua to the Gentiles. And he says this is in priestly service. Now, he was not a priest, right? But he understands that what he is doing in going to the Gentiles is in fulfillment of the priestly calling of the Jewish people. So, to be a servant of Messiah Yeshua to the Gentiles in priestly service to the good news of God, so that the offering up of the Gentiles might be pleasing, made holy by the Ruach HaKodesh, by the Holy Spirit. So in Messiah Yeshua, I have reason to boast before God. He sees and understands that the Gentiles coming to faith in Messiah is an act of worship, is an offering. He is wanting to come before the King and say, look at all the people that I brought with me. This is like unto the harvest to God that is promised, that is to come when in your counting of the Omer, when first fruits and going up all the way up to Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. He goes on to say, for I will not dare to speak of anything except what Messiah accomplished through me, to bring about the obedience of the Gentiles by word and deed. He wants to bring the nations into obedience to God, not only to Messiah Yeshua, but also to the way of life that he calls us to, that he calls the people of God to live by, the Torah, that fulfillment of that messianic prophecy of what is seen in Isaiah chapter 2, where the nations are going to go up to the mountain of the Lord to be taught his ways, that Torah will go forth out of Zion. He says, by word and deed, in the power of signs and wonders, in the power of the Spirit of God. So from Jerusalem and around even to I just lost it. I'm getting a tongue twister on here. Illyricum, thank you. I have fully proclaimed the good news of Messiah. Don't y'all hate it when that happens? When your tongue just gets stuck and it's like it needs a kickstart? But So he sees this ministry of taking Messiah to the nations as a fulfillment of Isaiah 52, verse 15. To those who have not been told, they're going to see. To those who have not heard, they're going to understand, so that even those kings will shut their mouths because of him and submit to him. He says, in this way I make it my aim to proclaim the good news, not where Messiah was already named, lest I build on another person's foundation, but as it is written, those who have never been told shall see, and those who have not heard shall understand. He's quoting from the Septuagint of Isaiah 52:15. And so Paul, he is living and he is serving his role. So many nations will be essentially, as we looked at last week, sprinkled and made clean and be acceptable offerings, allowed to be counted among the people of God and allowed to approach in the temple. And so here you're reading this first century Jewish Torah scholar. He clearly understood 52 and 53, Isaiah 52 and 53, this fourth servant song to be about the Messiah, and he saw himself as a servant of that servant. And he's continuing that work. I guess we're going to find out if we have a leak in the roof today. But so he saw himself in his fulfillment. He was living in the days of fulfillment of that understanding. And so Paul was right in line with other first century Jewish thought that understood this fourth servant song to be about the Messiah, as those Aramaic targums revealed. Isaiah 52:13, behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper, and he shall be exalted and extolled, and he shall be very strong. And that's what is powerful about all of this. This is what is to be expected about the Messiah. But as the passage goes on, not everybody believed the message about Messiah. Isaiah 53 verse 1 opens up. Who has believed? Who's believed this good news? Who's believed this report? To whom the arm of Adonai is revealed, that arm of redemption. And we last week we looked at that what is almost acting as a title of the arm of Adonai that reveals his redemption. That's a good study to go and do. But he says the ones to whom Messiah came first, the one to whom this was a fulfillment of prophecy, that they had received that prophecy. They didn't recognize him. As we looked at again last week, they were appalled by it. He didn't fit their expectations. He didn't fit their desires, as John 1 put it. That he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. Or as Luke 19, verse 41 put it, as he drew near and saw Jerusalem, he wept over her, saying, if only you had recognized this day the things that led to Shalom, but now they are hidden from your eyes. In verse 44, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Sorry that I couldn't see that down at the bottom. So who has believed? Who has believed our report? Report of Messiah's arrival. Report of this new Exodus beginning. The report of the prophet like unto Moses. Report of the redemption that's opened up now even unto the nations so that they may come. Who has believed it? Well, it was a mixed bag, right? It was a mixed bag among the Jewish people at first. When you read through the book of Acts and such, there were thousands, there were tens of thousands who believed, and that's wonderful, that's amazing, that's great. But you're talking about a population of millions. A few of the leadership believed. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, both members of the Sanhedrin. So there were some synagogue leaders who believed. There was a man who was even named Paul who came to believe eventually. But many did not. There was a tremendous corruption in the era. That's well known. And so while faith in Yeshua was growing among the Jews, they witnessed and they saw the arm of Adonai's redemption with their own eyes. They weren't coming in these overwhelming numbers. And oddly enough, what was so strange about the time period and the era is this message exploded among the Gentiles. Once that door was opened, it just went nuts. Those who didn't see it, those who didn't witness it for themselves, those who'd never really even heard of it before, hadn't received the Torah, hadn't heard the promises or the prophecies. They heard and believed in mass numbers. And that was the issue that they had to try to figure out and deal with back then, is what are we going to do with all these crazy Gentiles coming in and wanting to be a part of all of this? How do we bring them in? How do we incorporate them? Where do we start? They heard and believed. But what is Messiah supposed to do? So he will sprinkle many nations. He will cleanse them. The kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what had not been told them, they will see. What they had not heard, they will perceive. The arm of Adonai, his redemption, was revealed to his people, but not received in mass, not believed, not accepted, not as a whole. Why? Again, why not? Because he didn't meet the expectations. He didn't look like they thought he was going to look. He didn't do the things that he thought he was going to do. Again, the popular position, the most favorable theology that everyone wanted to see was, the Davidic king that was promised to subdue the nations. But that's not what came. That's not what he looked like. Isaiah 53, verse 2 puts out, this is what he looks like instead. For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root of dry ground, out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nor beauty that we should desire him. The he in this passage is the servant, is the one identified as Messiah. And he's talking about growing up or this shooting forth. It's related, it's a word related to the word aliyah, that can mean to ascend, or sometimes translated even related to an offering. He is this tender shoot. The word has the picture of, and if you are a gardener, if you have some of these plants in your yard or such like that, it's talking about those sucker saplings that many of the trees and bushes type of have that grow up right at the base of the plant. Or like a tomato where some of the branches branch off and you're supposed to pluck those types of things out. This is the only time that word is used, but it's something that it draws its nourishment. It takes its nourishment from the other plant, and in some ways it's supposed to invoke the imagery of a child, of a baby, that's nursing. That goes all the way back to Isaiah chapter 9. But this root is the same word that's used in Isaiah 11:1 and verse 10, talking about the root of Jesse. This root, it pops up in unexpected places, where the root system of the larger tree has gone. It can be even some distance away from the main source, the main trunk, but it's still drawing its nourishment from that system. On the surface, you can't even tell that it's there at all. I planted some elderberry bushes a few years ago at my property, and I've just had to cut down a dozen of those little saplings and those little things that start growing up off the bottom and popping up, where I didn't plant them. But nothing about the servant's coming, nothing about this root of Jesse's appearance are going to make people think that, oh man, here's the guy, here is the king. He had no form or majesty that we should consider and look at him. He doesn't fit the part. But that hasn't always worked out too well when that was the standard. Looking the part hasn't always worked very well, and not looking the part has worked out pretty well. That's what happened in the days of Samuel, the prophet Samuel, when he first met Saul, who became King Saul. He was a guy who was hiding among some of the luggage and some of the things, but they ran and brought Saul from his hiding place, ironically. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders up. And then Samuel announced to all the people, "Do you see the one Adonai has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people." And then all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king." He was chosen because of his appearance. He was taller than everybody else. And despite the fact that Saul had been hiding, they took one look at him and say, "Well, that looks like a king. That looks like somebody who could lead us into battle." And yet, that's not he didn't have the kind of heart that God wanted for his king. So even if he looked the part, he wasn't a good fit. And in contrast, when you look at David, he didn't look the part at all. When Samuel went to anoint one of Jesse's sons, that's all he was told. Go to see Jesse and anoint one of his sons. And Samuel himself was caught up in this whole activity of appearances when he saw the first son of Jesse, Eliab, thinking, he said, "Surely Adonai's anointed one is standing before me." However, God says in chapter 16, verse 7, that God is searching not for his appearances, he is searching for the right candidate to be king. He says, Adonai said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or his stature, because I have already refused him. For he does not see a man as man sees, for a man looks at the outward appearance, but Adonai looks into the heart." The one that God works through, the one that God has chosen, the one who is the servant, isn't going to be obvious to everybody. When Eliab wasn't chosen, they went through every one of the rest of Jesse's sons, and none of them were chosen. And then came the afterthought. His youngest son, who they didn't even bother to bring into this event. They didn't bother to call him in from tending the flocks. His youngest son, David, was handsome. He was young, but he was dismissed as a serious candidate by his father, by his brothers. Yet Samuel was told to arise and anoint David as king, to the surprise and shock of everybody, because he didn't look the part. And even after this happened, when Goliath challenged, he challenged and insulted the Israeli army, and none of his brothers, not anybody else from the tribes, were willing to step up and face this giant. David, again, wasn't looked upon as a king or as a warrior when he said, "I'll go and fight him." In fact, Saul, because he so didn't look the part, it's like he didn't want to be embarrassed by sending out such a shrimp. He tried to make him look the part by dressing him in the king's armor. Remember that. Saul said to David, "You cannot go fight the Philistine, for you're just a youth." And he has been a warrior since his youth. And so then Saul clothed David with his own garb, put a bronze helmet on his head, and clothed him in armor. He clothed him in the king's armor, so he would better look the part. David strapped his sword on his garment and tried to walk, but he was not used to it. Okay, these things don't fit. That's not who I am. That's not how I fight. So David said to Saul, "I cannot even walk in these, for I'm not used to them." so David took them off. David didn't come, he didn't appear as a king at this time. He didn't look the part. He didn't fit the expectations. He couldn't even wear the clothes of a king, couldn't wear the armor of the king to fight in the battles. But did that mean, because he didn't look like a king and couldn't fight like a king, did that mean that he couldn't fight at all? Did that mean that he could not win this fight in a different way? It took a different kind of warrior to fight the battle that was needed, to fight that particular enemy. One who had the staff, one who had a stone. One they only allowed to fight this fight in the first place because they were so desperate and nobody else was even willing. And when it came, even the pagan Goliath didn't think this little boy could possibly be chosen to face him in battle. Chapter 17, verse 42 says, "Now when the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him, he disdained him, for he was just a ruddy boy with a handsome appearance. Then the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And then the Philistine cursed David by his gods." This is what's so amazing about this moment, and how it's so reminiscent of where we're in Isaiah chapter 53. The true king of Israel stood right in front of everybody's face, both Jew and Gentile, and neither one of them recognized him as king. Even his brothers rejected him. David was a tender shoot with no form or majesty that he should be considered a king. And again, just like the Messiah, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form, no appearance or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. David at least was handsome. Right? There's nothing about that. They say one of the elections in the 60s, JFK won one of those elections based upon his appearance in one of the first televised debates in color. Or no, it was still in black and white, I think is how it goes. That he won that because it was in the black and white, he wore a certain color shirt that showed up better in black and white than what Nixon wore. And by the end of the day, Nixon still had he had a 5 o'clock shadow going on, but JFK had shaved right before. So he looked clean, he looked sharp, he looked nice on television. And that was one of the first things that got him the victory, because he looked the part. But that's not what God looked at and judged Messiah by. Goes on, he says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. That word said of Messiah that he was despised, it's an interesting one. David, he was despised and rejected multiple times. This very word is used in David's life several times. It's the word baza. It means to hold in contempt or worthless, or to trample with the feet. And the first time it's used is in, that should be Genesis 25. Esau despised his birthright. Right? Then it's used in 1 Samuel 17, right where we were, where the giant despised David. It's used in 2 Samuel chapter 6 with his wife, Michal, when she despised her husband when he was bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And then it was even said of David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, that in that whole situation with Bathsheba and Uriah, and how he arranged for Uriah's death and everything else like that, that David was the one who was despising the word of Adonai. So it's used several times in David's life. But this being despised, the same is true of Messiah, of Yeshua. He was despised and rejected. And, the Jewish people in the first century They had this certain picture, this certain expectation of what Messiah was going to look like, what he was going to do, and it actually made them blind when he actually showed up. Blind to his appearance. They didn't recognize the time of his visitation. They missed the signs. They misinterpreted the moment. And we have to be careful because we're very much in danger of doing the same thing in our own day, both believers and unbelievers, people who don't believe at all. You look at many of the believers that are out there, many of the congregations and churches out there, they have their charts and their timelines of, they know just exactly how everything's going to proceed. Y'all seen those before? They have it down to the T and almost by the minute. As soon as they hit start, then the button goes and they know exactly what comes next. Or so they think. They have so much, they think they're in so much control of the end times. And I'm afraid they're going to actually be blinded when it really starts happening. They might be deceived if it doesn't go according to plan. It doesn't follow the chart. Because we're not really any different in our day than they were then. But today, we have the benefit of hindsight of some things. They had a hard time seeing the first and the second coming of Messiah. But they did see the pattern. They did see the pattern of the suffering servant, the Messiah, son of Joseph, ben Joseph, and they also saw the pattern of the victorious king, the Messiah, ben David. Scripture reveals them both. And from our perspective, it's a lot easier for us to see and consider because of when we live. When we started Isaiah several months ago, early on I shared how this would be difficult for them to see using the idea of mountain peaks and things. We are, as we understand it, right here, essentially between the peaks. We can look back in time and we can see his first coming. We can look forward in time and we can see, the second coming. We're benefiting because of when we live. But if you live before the days of Yeshua, if you were, Abraham, who, as Yeshua talked about in John chapter 8, who looked forward to seeing Yeshua's day, if you were in his time, then both of these descriptions of Messiah, both of these mountain peaks were still in the future. Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. Think of it like when you see mountains from a distance. Right? Sometimes they are easy to tell apart. Sometimes it gets a little more difficult. It's hard to tell, okay, exactly how many mountains are in front of us. Is it one mountain? Is it two? Is it others? If there is two, then which one is being stood upon, right? See, if we weren't so limited by our perspective, we're really only looking, we can see what's already happened, but we can really only look in one direction, only looking forward. That affects what we can see. Because sometimes the scriptures, a verse describes the Messiah, son of David, that great and conquering king. And then a verse nearby, or sometimes even the same verse, describes the suffering of Messiah ben Joseph. And those in the Tanakh knew with certainty that Messiah was coming, that the kingdom of God was coming, but how that would take place, the order that takes place, the time frame, what it would look like, those details were harder to see. And they're only looking forward. Things are lining up in one direction. Abraham, Isaiah, and all of the other prophets would see Messiah like this. They would see Messiah ben Joseph. They would see Messiah ben David. They'd see both of them out there in the future. But they would have a difficult time distinguishing between the two peaks, that if they were separate, how much distance was between them. if they could tell at all. Right? That's the challenge that they faced. And because the most popular concept, Messiah, son of David, didn't happen the way they thought, but instead the suffering servant came first, Yeshua didn't fit the part, and he was despised, he was rejected, and it caused great grief and sorrow and weeping, even on his part. When Lazarus was in the grave in John chapter 11, Yeshua wept. And he wept even knowing what he was just about to do. He was about to raise Lazarus up from the dead. He wept because those in the crowd were still not going to believe. They were still going to reject about what was about to happen. And later, we looked at this passage already in Luke 19 as he was entering Jerusalem, where he said he drew near and he wept over Jerusalem. If only you had recognized this day the things that lead to shalom, but now they are hidden from your eyes. It grieved him. It grieved Yeshua that they did not know him, they did not recognize him, they did not acknowledge who he was. It grieved him that his brothers, whom he came for, in fulfillment of all those promises made to Abraham, would reject and despise him. It grieved Yeshua that there would be consequences. And he addressed the fact that because they don't recognize him, that Jerusalem would be surrounded by foreign armies and the temple destroyed, because Yeshua, he actually loves Jerusalem. He loves the temple, the place that Adonai chose to make his name dwell. That's the promised place of Messiah's throne, the ruling center of the kingdom of God on earth. Yeshua proved he loved the temple in the very next verses when he drove out the money changers and merchants, saying, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer. You have made it a den of thieves." This grief is also related to, it's often translated as even sickness, that word grief in there, that he is acquainted, he is familiar with, he has knowledge of the sickness, and he heals many people. He heals even leprosy. It's this kind of familiarity that's led some in the rabbinic tradition to call this description of him here the leper Messiah, the leper scholar, who can touch the greatest disease and not become unclean or contaminated by it. Instead, he heals the leper and makes the unclean clean. I know we said it before, it's been a little while, but there were 3 to 4, and depending on where you see the source you're looking at, 3 to 4 signs that only the Messiah can do. And one of them is that idea of leprosy, that he can heal leprosy. The second one is that he can drive out a demon from someone who is mute. Because the belief, the understanding was that in order to drive out a demon, you had to find out what the demon's name was. And if the person's not allowed or not able to speak, then you can't learn the demon's name. Then there's no way for you to drive them out. But Messiah will be able to do that. He'll be able to heal someone who's been born blind. And that he will even be able to raise the dead. Matthew chapter 8, the Gospels present all of these situations. Matthew chapter 8, Yeshua stretched out his hand and touched this man who had leprosy. He says, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately his tarat, his leprosy, was cleansed. And Yeshua said to him, "See that you tell no one, but go and show yourself to the Cohen, to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." It would be a testimony to them. It would be a testimony to them because they had never seen it happen. Matthew chapter 9 says, "As they were going out, a mute man plagued by a demon was brought to him." A mute man. It's specific. It says, after the demon was driven out, the mute man started speaking. The crowds were astounded, saying, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." Why? Because this is something the only Messiah can do. In John chapter 9, it says, as Yeshua was passing by, he saw a man who had been blind since birth. his disciples asked him, the question, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? One of them must have done something to deserve this. Yeshua answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. This happened so that the works of God might be brought to light in him. And having said these things, he spat on the ground, he made mud with the saliva, he spread the mud on the blind man's eyes, and he told him, go and wash in the pool of Shalom, which is translated sent. And so he went away, washed, and came back seeing. That's the first three. And I've already mentioned, he healed the leper, he healed the mute, demon-possessed, and he's healed the man born blind. And I've already mentioned Lazarus, who was in the tomb for 4 days, had begun to smell when he was called out by Yeshua. And in spite of all of this, Isaiah 53 says he was despised and rejected by men. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. There's an important word in all of this that is often overlooked, and in fact it was actually back in verse 2, and it starts to take over in the passage here. At the beginning of the verse, Isaiah seems to be speaking generally about people, but then suddenly there's this word, we. You see it? He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Who is this we? Suddenly Isaiah is using language that's including himself. We as in all humanity, or we as in the Jewish people to whom Messiah was sent, we to whom the promises and the prophecies and signs were all given. This we language makes it a lot harder to identify the servant as Israel itself, since that would make Israel rejecting and despising Israel. The servant does more for all of this we. And that's part of the blessing. In verse 4, Isaiah goes on. He says, surely he has borne our griefs. Right? He's including himself in that. This is that we language. He has borne our griefs. He has carried our pains. Yet we esteemed him stricken, struck by God, and afflicted. So this servant, he is acquainted with griefs and sicknesses, and while some of them may be his own grief at knowing that they're rejecting him, the servant, the Messiah, also deals with our griefs and our pains. He bears ours. The knowledge, of good and evil, that was too great a burden for Adam and Eve, to carry. They were trying to carry it anyway. They thought they could, but it was too much. That gave them the burden of sin. They gave them the burden to carry of breaking God's Torah, His instruction, His command, that brought death. Again, a burden too great for them to carry, the penalty of that sin. Can you imagine the weight of it? The burden of it. It's a load we may try to carry, but it is far too great. And surely He has borne our griefs. He has carried our pain. And the language of this is that like that of the lowliest of servants. The ones who had strength but no real skill. The ones who are just like beasts of burden, that carry around all of the luggage or the weights of things or all of the stuff they want to take with them. Something little more than an ox or a camel that goes on caravan that is carrying all of the weight. And it's the servant who is carrying the burden that are not even his own. He is carrying the weight. He carries our griefs. He carries our pains. And He is able to carry them in a way that we cannot. He is willing to carry them on our behalf, even when we reject Him. And interestingly enough, that word for borne, He has borne our griefs. It's a word we looked at last week, nasa. That same word we looked at in Isaiah 52, verse 13, also used of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6 about the throne of God, where it's behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up. He is bearing. He will be borne up. Instead of being lifted up and carried around like you'll see sometimes about the king's litter that you think about, where other people are carrying him around, how he should be carried, how all of that as is proper and right, given his title and authority as king. As we see even in the picture of what the ark was all about, which is a picture of the throne of the king. Instead, he is the lowliest of servants, and he is carrying somebody else. He is carrying their burden. This servant came to serve and not be served. And instead of honoring this act of service, instead of recognizing that the fact that he bore our pain and our griefs, we see him carrying this burden and we scorn and mock him for it. He carries a burden too great for us, the sin and death, and we consider him stricken and struck by God. Stricken is most often translated as touch, touching with the hand. And the first time that's used is in Genesis chapter 3, when Eve mistakenly said, "You must not touch of the tree of knowledge of good and evil." But it also refers to an understanding of a heavy hand, of discipline and striking blows. And so if we do think of the servant at all, if we do consider the servant at all, we think of him deservedly struck and afflicted and punished by God. We think he deserved what he got every blow. He didn't fit the qualifications. He didn't fit our expectations of the Messiah. So he deserved to be humbled for trying to fill a role that he didn't belong to. So he deserved to die and everything that came to him. So that God was right and just in crucifying him. His name should be cursed. Be cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. And that's only half true. Because God was right. And he is just. With every blow Yeshua received. Because he was also merciful. Because the righteous servant didn't warrant those blows at all. It's that we stuff. Again, we did. The servant took the just and righteous punishment, the blows that should have been ours. That's what he carried. He carried those for us. And so he was pierced because of our transgressions. He was crushed, not for his own, but because of our iniquities. And the chastisement for our shalom was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. See, everything that happened to him, we should get that. That's the justice from God. Justice, you've maybe heard this before, justice is getting what you deserve. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. And then there's grace, which is getting an abundance of blessing that you don't deserve at all. That's what we get out of this exchange. Yes, we do get mercy, but even more, we get grace. We get shalom. And it's the chastisement that makes the shalom possible. Shalom with God that we have never experienced. Shalom with God that we've never had before, that wasn't possible before. We get healing, not just of our sicknesses, but healing from sin in general, healing from death as the end. We had no idea, because our understanding of how God works, His ways are not our ways. We had no idea what it would take to bring us shalom with Him. We never could have guessed the cost, not to us, but to Him. Again, I'm going to look at this again. Remember, that's what Yeshua said when He wept over Jerusalem in Luke 19. As He drew near, He wept. If only you had recognized this day the things that lead to shalom. If only you knew what it was going to cost. But now they're hidden. You don't see it. You're expecting something else. If only you knew. If only you considered what's about to happen as God's plan, that this is what He's been planning all along. This is what all the prophecies are about. That this is what it would cost to redeem His people, to reveal the arm of the Lord. That God would provide Himself the sacrifice. On the mountain, Adonai will provide our peace, our shalom. He makes it possible. It was up to Him. It was dependent upon Messiah Yeshua and the stripes and the bruising that He would receive. Remember, that's all the way back from Genesis chapter 3. He would crush the serpent's head, but His heel would be bruised. He would not come out of this unscathed or unwounded. And as Yeshua Himself talked about, just like the serpent in the wilderness was lifted up, He too had to be lifted up, not as a king, not like He deserved, but as this suffering servant. And in looking to Him, just like they did in the wilderness when they were bitten by the snakes, they had to look to the serpent up on the pole. In looking to Him lifted up, we find healing. In looking to Him, our eyes are open and we are no longer blind. In Him, we find our shalom. That we would recognize in our day, in these moments, in our lifetime, what leads to our peace. That's what each one of us needs to do. And what each one of us needs to acknowledge is that the servant has made the way. Even though he was not recognized for it at the time. He is our peace. Because of our transgressions, because of our iniquities. That was upon Him, and by His stripes we are healed.